Here is Monteverde Blueberry Muffin, a magenta ink.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink.
Fear not about how dark the swatch is. The magenta in the writing sample is milder and much more pleasant. This is a great alternative to a red. Now, there is only the slightest tone shift as the paper changes, and there is some shading that comes through, though there isn't a ton, and there is less shading as the paper gets cheaper. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, it generally performed well and is more than passable. I really enjoyed the tone as I got on the National Steno, and the chromatography will really show you what influence that the makeup of this ink really had on the tone. Really comes through well in the National.
The pen for today is a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Really a beautiful magenta tone here with, little hints of some red that's going on that you're going to see in some of the shading. Not an onslaught of shading, but if you look at onslaught on the second line, you do see some of that shading coming through, where on is a little bit darker than the SL that lighten up a little bit. The A darkens a little, the U lightens up a little bit. The GL AU, a little messy in my writing here. Nice midtones. The T at the end did get a bit darker. Looking at the back of the page, you can see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting, so this is a great ink if you write on the back of the page, like I do.
Let's take a look at some other inks from the same manufacturer.
Here is Monteverde Capri Blue. Here is Monteverde Caribbean Blue.
Here is Monteverde Crocodile.
Here is Monteverde Emerald Green.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook.
For a tone, this is slightly lighter and I want to call it dustier than we had on the Clairfontaine. Now, I don't really see any feathering and I'm not seeing any kind of spread, though this paper does tend to do well when it comes to that. There's some shading that does go on a little bit, but you really have to be on your guard to find it. Perhaps get a bodyguard like on line 3, where most of this is really a mid-tone, but it's the YG in the middle that's ever so slightly darker. So it does do very well in all of that, and it looks great on the page. Looking at the back of the page, you see no bleeding, no ghosting. This paper does so well with fountain pen inks. It's amazing that it's not more known in the community.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
The tone that we're getting here is really just a little bit lighter and at times just a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. Now, we're not having feathering and we're not having spread, which is always great news to hear. We are getting some shading that's going on while still looking amazing. Take a look at while still on the third line. The W is a little bit darker than the HI that lightened up a little bit, but that LE at the end gets quite a bit darker. Still starts lighter, works its way darker all through the word to the last L. Looking at the back of the page, you see how strong this paper really holds up against the fountain pen. No bleeding and no ghosting, so great news.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
We see a tone here that is very much the same as we had on the Clairfontaine. Not surprising. It doesn't feather and it doesn't spread. Not surprising. It does shade as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. Again, not surprising. But the real reason to be looking at this is the quad rule. Look at how well it stands out against this quad rule, really meaning you can use it if this is the type of line work that you prefer on the paper. I think this is doing great, and I think that a student that uses this has really good taste. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding and no ghosting to no surprise.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Ackerman, their number 12. Here is Diatramentis Magenta Red Bronze. Here is Diamine Burgundy Royale. Here is Noodler's Cuprin.
The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
The tone that we get here is a bit lighter and oddly a bit kind of pink leaning for this paper. Now, this paper does have a tendency to alter the tone that we see in the ink. It's not feathering, it's not spreading. There is little moments of shading. They just show up a little bit at a time, and it's just there. I mean, if you look at Southern on the second line, you see that the H is a bit darker than the rest of the word, so it does very nice. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding, no ghosting, and no problems.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page.
Here is Robert Oster Blue Black. Here is Sailor Bungu Box Melancholic Gray. Here is Sailor Studio 770. Here is Wancher Original Tenmoku Black.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here we get a tone that is noticeably darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does noticeably spread. I mean, remember, this is a fine nib that's going on. Looks much more like a medium. There's tiny bits of feathering, but I'm not going to hold what's going on there really against it. You see it a little bit with the E into the T of trumpet on the first line or gate on the first line, but this is 20-pound copy paper after all. So any kind of feathering, not as long as it's not distracting in itself, not the end of the world. And the spread is really manageable. Shading, a couple of spots do come through, which does tend to worry me. Makes me think that sometimes that, when that happens, it bleeds. So hopefully it doesn't bleed here, but otherwise, I think this is a good ink on this paper. Looking at the back of the page, you can see that the ink got very deep into the paper, so you probably can't write back here and salvage both sides of notes. However, nothing bled through touching the page underneath, so it still gets to be a winner on this paper.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The dry writing soft fine of the Platinum 3776 generally exposes any weaknesses an ink has, and I don't think there are any weaknesses here. Off camera, I used this in a wet medium nib, and it did darken a bit, enough to look very different as an ink, and it did shade less, but still looked very nice on the page. I would stay with a dry to medium flow, medium or broad nib to really get to enjoy all of the very nice shading, but especially to keep this amazing tone on the page.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.